We've been preaching through the Gospel of Mark, and we've looked at everything in the Gospel of Mark, and we've come up to the Friday that we know as Good Friday. That was about 2,000 years ago. Jesus is before Pilate, and Pilate's told him, "I have the power to crucify you or to let you go." And Jesus said, "You were only given that power from above. Otherwise, you would have no such power." And Pilate has sort of pleaded on behalf of Jesus. But the Jews had a practice at the Passover feast that Pilate would let a criminal go. And so Pilate said, "I think I know how to get them." Because Pilate knew that they were just mistreating Jesus, that they were just jealous of him, that it was done out of envy and spite. He knew that. And so he said, "I know how I'll get him." He said, "What I'll do is I'll offer to release one, and it'll be Jesus." And so he said to them, "You know what? I'll release one today, like I always do on your Passover feast. Would you like me to release Jesus, King of the Jews?" And the leadership of the Jews stirred up the crowd. Now imagine this, being so envious and so jealous and so full of hatred toward a person that you would stir up a crowd to lie against him. Well, that's what they did. And the word there really in Greek is they agitated. If you have an old washing machine, we used to have an old washing machine that you put the clothes in and it go, and that agitator would just go like this, and that's how the clothes wash. Well, that's what they were doing to the crowd. They were just messing them up, mixing them up, and getting them going. And so they said, "We want Barabbas." And Barabbas was a notorious killer. And they wanted him. And he said, "Well, what do you want me to do with the King of the Jews?" And they said, "Crucify him. We want you to crucify him." And so Pilate handed him over to be crucified. Now Matthew 26 tells us that he washed his hands in front of them and said, "My hands are clean of all of this." Well, his hands were clean. But he made that gesture. And so the soldiers take Jesus and they lead him away. And it says that they called together the whole battalion. Now, I don't know, I did some research on this and I didn't come up with anything really concrete. But I understand that a battalion was between 430 and 500 men. And so that's how many men they called together. And there's this group of men with Jesus, who is being led like a lamb to the slaughter. Can you imagine calling 450 men together to slaughter a lamb? Well, that's what they've done. Treating him like a criminal. And they scourge him. And they put a purple cloak on him, and the purple represented royalty. And they put it on to mock him. And they ground a crown of thorns into his head. And they mocked him and they saluted him sarcastically. And they spit in his face and they hit him. And then they tore that robe off again. Now imagine having been beat, and when he was whipped, the lashes he took opened up all the skin on his back. And when that robe was put on, that robe would have stuck to his back. And then they tore it off of him. You can imagine what he was going through physically. And they did all of this to humiliate him. And their thinking is so human, so worldly. Their thinking is, he wouldn't do all of this if he had the power to stop it. That's their thinking. That's why they did what they did. And so he hands him over to be crucified. And so they're on their way out to Golgotha, the place of the skulls. And as they're leaving the area where he was sentenced and everything, they come across a man by the name of Simon of Cyrene. And it says that they compelled him to carry the cross of Jesus. Now, compel there means that they forced him. They grabbed him and they said, "You're one big dude, you can handle this job, and you're going to do it." Now, you got to understand that the Roman soldiers did this all the time. If they were walking along and there was a Jew standing there and they didn't feel like carrying their bag anymore or carrying something, they would hand it to that Jew and they could compel them to walk a mile with their carrying whatever the Jew wanted them to carry. And that's why Jesus said, if they tell you to go 1 mile, he said go 2. That's the whole theory behind that. So they compel this Simon to take the cross and carry it for Jesus. Now you and I aren't compelled to take our cross up for Jesus today. We have to desire to do that. We want to do that. We're not compelled. But Simon was compelled to carry that cross. But it must have had an effect on his family, because Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus. And I want to introduce you to Rufus, because if you look over in Romans, these probably were well-known Jews. And if you look over in Romans chapter 16 and verse 13, Paul says, "Greet Rufus." And this Rufus is the same Rufus that is the son of Simon of Cyrene. And so you know that for sure carrying that cross for Jesus had some effect on his family, because Rufus was in good standing with the church in Rome. But they compel him to carry the cross for Jesus, and they walk out to Golgotha, the place of the skulls. And it's not known for sure. It was a hill. It may have been a hill that was sort of shaped in the shape of a skull, or it could have been because of all the skulls that were laying around for the people that were crucified. Because when they crucified someone, they didn't take them off and bury them after, unless someone knew the person and they came along and did it. They wouldn't take them off there. They'd just fall off eventually. And so they're on their way to Golgotha. And Jesus, they crucify him. They nail him to the cross. And you can imagine the agony of all of that going on. Nails through the wrists or by the hands and the feet. And of course, the idea was that with the pain, you couldn't really pull yourself up or push yourself up. And when you sagged, you still had the pain. And when you sagged, you couldn't breathe properly. And it became more and more difficult to breathe. And that's what the crucifixion was. And so they nail him to this cross, and they lifted up the cross. Now I want you to see something. Jesus said, "As the serpent in the wilderness was lifted up, so the Son of Man will be lifted up." Jesus knew this was going to happen. He prophesied it would happen. And they're doing it to him, and they're mocking him in the process. But Jesus knows exactly what's going on. He has the purpose. He knows what he's doing. Unbeknownst to these people that are just really fulfilling the will of God, but by their evil intentions. And so they lift him up. And as he's on the cross there, they divide his garments amongst them. Now, we look at that and we say, what? But that was a common practice. When someone was crucified, the soldiers divided the spoils, so to speak. So the garments that were left behind by the guy on the cross, the soldiers divided amongst themselves. But that comes right out of Psalm 22 and verse 18. That was prophesied that this would happen. And so they divide the garments, and this happened. They let him out the third hour of the day, which would have been 9 a.m., because the first hour of the day was 6 a.m. to the Jews. And so the third hour of the day was 9 a.m. is when they crucified him. Okay, he's nailed to the cross, he's lifted up. And there's two robbers, two thieves that are crucified with him, one on each side. And the passers-by are looking at Jesus, and they're insulting him, and they're saying, look at the guy that healed others can't heal himself. Well, he could heal himself. He could have done it very easily, but he didn't. And they're saying, he said he'd raise the temple, break down the temple, in 3 days he'd build it back up. Well, he wasn't talking about the temple. He was talking about his body. And that was right in the process of happening. He saved others and he can't save himself. And then they say the ultimate thing. They say, you know what, Jesus, if you're King of the Jews, you come down off that cross and we'll believe you. Well, I'm here to tell you that if Jesus came off that cross, they still wouldn't have believed him, because they had a heart of disbelief. Because he did things just as great and even greater miracles in his ministry than coming down off the cross. If he can raise a man from the dead, coming down off the cross wouldn't have been a difficult thing. If he could walk on water, wouldn't be too hard to slip his hands off those nails and off his feet and jump down, right? I don't think it would have been that difficult a thing. So what they were asking him wasn't even as miraculous, you might say, as some of the miracles he did in his ministry. But they're saying, if you come down off that cross, then we'll believe you. Well, Mark says that the robbers did the same. The thieves that were crucified beside him did the same. Now think about that for a minute. You got 3 people on the cross. Why is all the focus on Jesus? You got 3 lives there. 3 lives that are being destroyed. Why is it focused on Jesus? Because of who Jesus was. That's why it was focused on him. And so, it comes to the 6th hour of the day. And they come by, and because it is the Passover feast coming up, 6 p.m., it starts. So it is now the 6th hour of the day, it's noon. They're saying, they're starting to think, we got to do something about this. But what happened? For 3 hours, everything went dark. Now think about that for a minute. Your guards, you're standing there, you're witnessing this, you're just around and you've been mocking Jesus on the cross, and all of a sudden, at high noon, everything goes pitch black. And you'll have people say today, oh, it was an eclipse of the sun. Or you'll have them say other things. But it was God doing this. And they started to recognize this. And so at the 9th hour, at 3 o'clock, 3 p.m., Jesus cries out, Eloi, Eloi sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? And people will tell you that God deserted Jesus on the cross. He did not desert Jesus on the cross, and I'll prove it to you. He didn't desert Jesus on the cross. He was with Jesus. But he cried out because our human nature feels that way. That when something like that is happening to us, we feel like God isn't with us. And that's our human nature. Because in Psalm 22 and verse 1, the psalmist David uttered those exact same words. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Did God ever forsake David? God never forsook David. But David was in a dire place. He was in a bad spot. And he felt like God had deserted him. And so he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Jesus said the same thing. And sometimes we say that. When we get in a bad spot, we think, oh man, where's God? Because if God was here, this wouldn't be happening. And yet, the truth may be that God is there, and it's happening maybe for your growth, maybe for your faith. It could be something, I don't know, but it happens. And so Jesus is on the cross. God has not forsaken him, but he cries out. And some of the standers by say, he's calling Elijah. Let's wait and see if Elijah comes. Let's just hang in here and see what happens. And so they're waiting and seeing. But Jesus says, into your hands, and he doesn't say this in Mark, but he says in Matthew, into your hands I commit my spirit. Did God forsake him at the cross? I don't believe so. He said, into your hands I commit my spirit. God was there with him. And so he breathed his last. And the centurion, he's looking at this and he's going, whoa, this is the Son of God for sure. This has to be. With all that's gone on. But there's something critical we need to look at here. A crucifixion took a minimum of a day and a half to die, depending on your strength. And it could take, if you're unfortunate to be really strong and healthy when you're crucified, it could take 2.5 days. And so, how long have we been there? Well, he was put on the cross at 9 a.m. We're now talking 3 p.m. 6 hours. He hasn't been on the cross that long. And he dies. The only conclusion we can come to, the only conclusion that the scripture gives us, is that they did not kill Jesus. Jesus gave up his life for you and I. Jesus sacrificed his life willingly. In fact, I believe it's in John, where he said, John 20, verse 24, I lay down my life that I can pick it up again. And so, he's dead in 6 hours. He gave up his life. And so, it's Passover time. They don't want him hanging on that cross through the Passover. And so, Joseph from Arimathea comes along. Joseph that came to him secretly by night in John chapter 3. Comes and he goes and he asks if he can take the body and bury it. And so it was the day of preparation for the Sabbath. And so he gets permission from Pilate. Pilate calls the guards and he says, is Jesus really dead? Am I hearing right? This guy's already died? And the guards are like, yeah, he's dead. And so he asks Pilate, and Pilate says, yeah, you can have the body, you go bury him. Jesus' life wasn't taken from him. Jesus gave up his life. And they put him in the tomb, in a rich man's tomb, that was prophesied. And they just did a quick job on him, because you got to understand, they couldn't do anything with a dead body over the Passover. So from 6 p.m. Saturday night till 6 p.m. Sunday, 6 p.m. Saturday, when our Saturday would be 6 p.m., they couldn't do anything with the body. His body's already dead, so they want to bury it, so they do a quick job of wrapping him up before 6 p.m., between 3 and 6 p.m. there, and they put him in the tomb. And they say, well, after the Passover, we're going to come back and we'll do the burial properly. We'll complete the burial process. And so they go and they have their Passover feast. And by the way, I just want to point out that Jesus was the sacrificial lamb of the true Passover feast. The Passover feast where the blood of Christ covers us and God passes over our sins. Not just the death angel passing over us and killing our firstborn, but He's saving our lives by covering our sin so God overlooks our sin. That's the true Passover lamb. And it was done at the Passover. That's the reason it happened right then and there. So they go to their Passover. The first day of the week comes along. And here go the ladies. There's Mary and Mary Magdalene, or Mary from Magdala. And Magdala was a place where the women that weren't really right, and they were loose women and different things, they lived in this place called Magdala. Well, if you remember, Mary of Magdala, or Mary Magdalene, was possessed by 7 demons that Jesus cast out of her. So that's why she was living in Magdala. So she's known as Mary from Magdala, or Mary Magdalene. Just like Jesus of Nazareth, or Jesus the Nazarene. Same thing. That's how they term things then. So her and Mary and a couple of others, they're walking along and they're going out to complete this burial of Jesus. And everybody is down. I mean, Jesus has been killed. You can imagine the mood of the people. You can imagine, I mean, the apostles are probably mourning and crying. Well, we know they were. Mary and Mary Magdalene and all these people were mourning and in tears. And it was just a horrible time. Because they thought this was our Lord and Savior. And they went and killed them. And so they're walking out there, and you can almost see their heads down, and they're kicking the gravel as they're walking along. And they're musing amongst each other, and they're saying, how are we going to remove this stone? Because the stone was rolled in front of the tomb. And what they did with these stones is, these stones would be 5.5 to 6.5 feet in diameter. They're a huge stone, and what they usually did is they dug the tomb out of the rock, and they created this stone, and they had a rut where the stone was up and it was blocked, so it couldn't roll. And they had a rut in front of the tomb that they dug, and when the person was buried, they pulled the block out, and that stone rolled in that rut and settled in front of the tomb and just stayed there. And it was heavy. Some people say, I don't know, but some people say 2,000 pounds, some people say 4,000 pounds. I don't know how heavy, but you know how heavy rocks can be. Well, if you take a rock even that's 1 inch thick, and it's 6.5 feet in diameter, that's one heavy rock. And so they're out there and they're walking along, they're saying, I wonder how we're going to get this rock out of there, out of our way. Who are we going to get to move this rock? Because they had ways of moving them with the pry bars and different things. They could move them. And so they're discussing this, and they get to the tomb, and it's rolled away. Now you can imagine the shock on them. What would you think if you were heading out there and the stones moved? Well, what is going on? Who stole the body? What's going on? So they run into the tomb to see if his body's still there. And here sits a young man in white linen. And he says, who are you looking for? And they said, well, Jesus of Nazareth, of course. He's supposed to be buried here. And the young man says, he's risen. And you can imagine the look on their face. And things start coming to light that Jesus talked about for 3 years. Some of the prophecies that he talked about him, destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll rebuild it. Like Jonah, the son of man will be 3 days in the earth. He prophesied this. And they're thinking about these things, and he says, you need to run, and you need to tell the apostles. You need to go tell the apostles. And he says, I'll meet them on the way to Galilee. Well, that's where he met them in the first place, right? Why did the young man in the tomb say, he'll meet you on the way to Galilee? Because the guys had gone back fishing. They had gone back to who they were before they met Jesus. Think about that. And so he rose on the first day. Mary goes and tells the apostles, and the apostles are weeping and all grieving. And then they become unbelieving. They don't believe her that he's risen from the dead. They refused to believe her that he had risen from the dead. And other accounts tell us they ran out to the tomb after and they checked themselves and they found out and all of these things and everything. But they didn't believe. It would have been a hard thing to believe. Have you ever seen anyone come up out of the grave? If someone came along and told you here right now that their uncle came out of a grave, would you believe it? Yeah, it'd be difficult, wouldn't it? However, with them it should have been different. Because Jesus had told them about this. But they didn't believe, and so he meets two of the disciples on the road. They meet two other disciples on the road and they tell them, and the disciples didn't believe. They had a hard time until they actually met Jesus face to face. But they met Jesus face to face. And they realized he had risen from the dead. You see, all that gory stuff that went on, all that doom and gloom, in a twinkling of an eye, in just a matter of 2 days, it was glory for Jesus. He had risen from the grave. Now imagine the swing of emotions that took place with the apostles, that took place with the disciples that had followed Jesus to the cross. Imagine being so down and all of a sudden so high, because he had risen from the dead. And that's what Jesus did. And for those people in the first century, well, they had their proof. They had the prophecies of Jesus. Jesus said, I'll lay down my life and I'll take it back up. Jesus said, destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll rebuild it. He said, the Son of Man, just like Jonah, will be 3 days in the earth and then he'll come back out of it. He told them all of that. And you know something? In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 63, and I just clued into this week, that it really hit me what's happened. The Jewish leaders go to the Roman officials and they say, we remember this scoundrel when he said that he was going to rise again. They knew he said that. They understood what he was talking about. They were afraid that he was going to come up out of that grave. They did that so purposely and so intentional to Jesus. It's awful. But they did it. And that's what evil does. But they knew it, that he had said that. They ignored everything that Jesus taught them. But they knew it. And so they went to them and they said, he said he's going to rise from the... We want that thing guarded. And they guarded that tomb. Now I'm telling you, when the Roman soldiers guarded something, they guarded it with their life. If they didn't successfully guard it, it cost them their life. They died in torture and shame. And their families were shamed out of society. There is not a guard that wanted to do that wanted to fail in his mission. And they put the guards out there over that grave. And Jesus rose from the grave. Imagine that. The guards couldn't stop him. Now, a lot of people, well, I'm not going to go there yet. So, the tomb's empty. If you were living in the first century and someone said That's where Jesus was buried. That rock was rolled in front of there, and it was guarded by Roman centurions. And you went and told somebody came and stole the body, they would tell you you're nuts. They wouldn't believe you for a minute. They had all the proof that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. The cover-up by the Jewish leaders is proof of it. And then he appeared to many. They had more proofs than enough in the first century that Jesus had risen from the grave. But what about you and I today? See, we run into a problem. There's theories out there like the swoon theory. He just kind of passed out. Now imagine this. He'd hung on the cross. He had a spear stuck in his side. He had been lashed probably 39 times. 40 less 1. And he had all this massive loss of blood. And he just kind of passed out. And then he quietly, when he was in the grave, he quietly rolled the stone away, this big stone. He rolled it away. And because he couldn't do miracles, remember, he was just he was blasphemous and everything, right? And he rolled that stone away, and he snuck out between the guards, and they never had a clue. Are you kidding me? But people want us to believe that. Some say he was stolen. And you can read all kinds of stories about what Jesus did. But what we have here are people that are living 2,000 years later, and they're trying to determine what happened 2,000 years ago without reading the only real literature on what happened, because they don't want to believe it. Now, who are you going to believe? Because, see, you and I, we have eyewitnesses. We have eyewitness testimony of Jesus' resurrection. The grave was empty. The prophecies were fulfilled. We have so much testimony here. In 1 Corinthians 15, I want you to turn there. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul said to the Corinthians, as he was trying to tell them about the resurrection of Christ and the resurrection that we will have, he says, starting in verse 3, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures." Get that? I mean, the Scriptures said that would happen, and he did. "And he was buried, and he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures." Again, that was prophesied would happen, and it happened. "And that he appeared to Cephas," or Peter, "then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep," or some have died physically. He says that Jesus appeared to over 500. If I count right, he appeared to at least 512 people. How many people do you need to tell you that Jesus was risen from the grave? How much proof do you need? We got enough proof. It's just whether we want to believe it or not. And so I have very good news for all of us today. Jesus, 2,000 years ago, beginning Friday, that weekend, he went from gory to glory, so that you and I can go from gory to glory. Because when we're in our sin, it's gory, it's ugly. And that's how God sees it. And when we have the blood of Christ covering us, it's glory for us. And so Jesus died for you so that you can live. I don't know where you're at this morning. I don't know what you believe for sure. But if you don't believe that Jesus came up out of that grave, you need to examine your heart. Because Jesus came up out of that grave. He has victory over death, and we have victory over death in Him. And you can have that victory if you just listen to Christ. If we can help you with anything, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.
and tenderly Jesus is calling, calling for you and for me. See on the portals he's waiting and watching, watching for you and for me. Come home, come home, ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling, O sinner, come home. Why should we tarry when Jesus is pleading, pleading for you and for me? Why should we linger and heed not his mercies, mercies for you and for me? Come home, come home, ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling, O sinner, come home. Time is now fleeting, the moments are passing, passing from you and from me. Shadows are gathering, deathbeds are coming, coming for you and for me. Come home, come home, ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling, O sinner, come home. Oh, for the wonderful love he has promised, promised for you and for me. Though we have sinned, he has mercy and pardon, pardon for you and for me. Come home, come home, ye who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling.